Hi, this is Sherry. This is a note to my listeners. One of these stories gave me nightmares. Guess which one? Let me know in the comments. And thank you for listening. Chapter 11, Catchfield Hall, the Midlands. The terrible heads that rise through the floor. Number blank, The Terrace, Worcester, March 1st, 1908. Dear Mr. Elliott O'Donnell, I thought you would be interested to hear that I met Mrs. Blake last night at the Stows, where I got out of her with no small amount of pumping an account of what she saw at that notorious ball at Catchfield some years ago. It is very horrible, too horrible, perhaps even for such a spook gourmand as you. Of course, all the names I have given you are fictitious. You know there have been several libel cases lately in connection with haunted houses, so one cannot be too careful. Yours sincerely, Evelyn D. O'Grady. The story. My invitation to spend the Christmas holidays with Lady Wentworth came as a delightful surprise. Imagine me, a poor insignificant little schoolmistress with St. Rudolph's, suddenly blossoming out into a much-envied guest at Catchfield. Who can blame me if I indulged in a momentary outburst of pride? So far my lot in life had not been all couleur de rose. Losing my husband shortly after our marriage, I had been obliged to do something for a bare living. My education, though fair, had fallen short of Girton or a degree, and I was barely qualified to teach any but very small children. Had I but foreseen the future, I might no doubt have done better. As it was, my position was only that of a kindergarten schoolmistress in St. Rudolph's. I do not think you can truly estimate a person's disposition till you see how they behave to those who have the misfortune to be in subordinate positions. Nor can you always tell a shoddy lady from a real one until you discovered how she treats her governess and servants. Until I taught in St. Rudolph's, I had no idea how thoroughly common were the majority of the so-called aristocracy, but one term was quite sufficient to show me that dealing with such hopelessly and innately vulgar people would be almost more than I could bear. It was therefore scarcely a matter of wonder that when Christmas drew nigh, the Christmas after my first sojourn in St. Rudolph's, I was almost beside myself with joy on receiving a pressing invitation to stay at Catchfield Hall. Nothing soothes the sensitive nature of a snob more than to call other people snobbish. The parents of my children were the middle class, middlish, snobs with a very big S, and should anyone need proof of the correctness of this assertion, let me point to him the fact that whenever a moneyed person came to reside within any get-at-able distance whatsoever, the person I had designated as snob made all haste to call upon them. Even the bishop, whose object in coming to St. Rudolph's was only to confirm, was inundated with invitations to dinner, and the rival claims of eligibility of those invited to meet him were openly discussed at afternoon tea and bridge parties. Let me also add that their club, ludicrously labeled Select, boycotted one of its members for some trivial remark, true enough, but like so many other homely truths better left unsaid, and that these very people who sat in judgment themselves indulged in the most scathingly rude remarks to those who for certain reasons were obliged to grin and bear it. Therefore, I repeat again, the parents of my children were snobs, and being snobs would not allow anyone in the humble position of a schoolmistress to say anything that might in any way be construed into snobbishness. Depict to yourself, then, how indignant they were, how I laughed up my sleeve when I let slip, quite by mischance you understand, the fact that I was going to spend Christmas with my very near kinsman, Lord Robert Wentworth. A schoolmistress related to a peer. How preposterous, how absurd, how snobbish! And they laughed at first scornfully, then incredulously, then pityingly, and I humbly bowed them out of the house, and running upstairs continued my packing. Vale St. Rudolph's. Welcome Catchfield. Under these circumstances, you can imagine why I tell you all of this. It is to show you how more than overjoyed I was at the thought of eating my Christmas pudding among gentlefolk. When I got out of Highfield, the nearest station to Catchfield, my lord's brougham stood waiting. "They are very full up at the hall, madam," the coachman said, touching his hat respectfully. "Otherwise, my lady would have sent one of the motors, but they have both had to go out longish distances." "Is there a house party?" I faltered, giving one of the horses, I love horses, a gentle pat on the head. "What, didn't you know? I beg your pardon, madam, the fellow added suddenly, recollecting himself, but it is the coming-of-age party of the Honourable Walter early next week that has fetched well-nigh half the county. You see, he is the eldest son, and, well, madam, there is to be a very big ball. I made sure madam knew all about it. I shook my head despairingly. Balls were not for such as I. I had neither a dress nor the money wherewithal to buy one. Most decidedly, I ought not to have come. I glanced at the man to see if he understood my misgivings. Apparently he did not. Perhaps he would not, his manner at all events less deferential, and as he shut the carriage door with the courtly air of an old gallant, I compared him with the parents of St. Rudolph's, the comparison of course being all in his favor. I will not attempt to describe the exterior of Catchfield. It has been done so often and so well in historical romances, in biographies, directories, that any additional effort of mine would be at once superfluous and poor. I arrived there late, too late for dinner, and partook of a dainty supper laid expressly for me in the ballroom presumptive. Fancy supper by myself in a ballroom! But there was apparently a doubt as to which of the rooms would be used for the occasion, his lordship being somewhat reluctant at present to allow this handsomely, I might almost say somberly, furnished apartment to be used for such a frivolous purpose. Remembering Robert's sanctimonious bringing up, I was not in the least surprised at his qualms, my only wonder being that he countenanced a ball at all. But of course that was my lady's doings. I much wished to inquire why a solitary meal for one such as I should be served in a room of such splendid dimensions, and one that in most households would undoubtedly have been used as a drawing-room, but I refrained, not desiring to appear inquisitive in the eyes of the servants. Her ladyship arrived as I was finishing my second cup of fragrant coffee, and despite a certain languid hauteur characteristic of the modern nobility, she appeared to welcome me. I felt this, and yet somehow I was puzzled at an indescribable something in her manner that was quite apart from pride, something that left me with the undecidedly pleasant impression that she was surely acting a part. And yet, why should she? Why should her ladyship be anything but frank with the poor and inoffensive cousin of her husband? But what was it that made her eyes fall as they encountered mine, and wander furtively round the room? And why that sudden look of fear that crept into them as they alighted on the fireplace? "You won't mind sitting here till bedtime, will you?" she observed. "I will tell Webster, my maid, to bring you your candle at 11 o'clock. If there is anything you want, you have only to tell her. All our guests play bridge, and I concluded from what Robert told me you didn't approve of gambling, so I thought you would be happier here. We are expecting other anti-gamblers in a few days, so your banishment will be only temporary. You will excuse us for a time, won't you?" What other reply could I give but, "Oh, yes, most certainly. It is indeed kind of you to allow me the use of such a lovely room," etc. And Lady Wentworth departed from my presence with a most patronizing and highly gracious smile. I was of course charmed and flattered, as any poor connection by marriage should be, but I wished all the same that Robert also had come to welcome me. I should have felt more at ease with Robert. I liked Robert, and, well, I did not like his beautiful and accomplished wife. Had he only come for 2 minutes, I should not have minded, but I was tired, I felt neglected, and I longed for kindness after St. Rudolph's. It was not like Robert. We had been such friends in our youth, children together, playmates, chums. Had money and position changed his nature? Money. I grew dispirited. I was poor, terribly poor. I was lonely, oh, so lonely. The room was huge, the night cold, and the fire small, very small. Drawing my chair close to it, I simulated ease. I tried to feel cozy. What a barrier, an insurmountable barrier, was poverty to pleasure. Would Robert's wife have banished a countess? Fancy a countess experiencing a reception such as this. A countess in a vast room empty save for draughts and a Lilliputian fire. A countess, I laughed. I was growing common like the other mediocre parents of St. Rudolph's. Vulgarity is catching. It is both epidemic and endemic. Had Robert told her I disapproved of playing cards for money? Of course not. That was a society taradiddle. He didn't know my scruples, or he would never have asked me to meet his wife. She She had guessed my poverty by my profession. All schoolmistresses are poor. Every one that teaches is poor. Education must be gratis. A cold blast of air from the chimney made me shiver. The room was indeed draughty. And how still! I did not altogether like such stillness. It got on my nerves. And how dark! Why were all the gas jets lighted? Why only this one? Because I was poor, the poor should learn to be economical. An example is better than precept. Hence this feeble flicker. A flicker that, failing to reach the further extremities of the chamber, left the corners enveloped in shrouds of darkness, of a black impenetrable darkness I could neither fathom nor comprehend. The furniture was superb, but it was way too funereal a texture and color to be pleasing to me just then. I would have preferred something of a brighter tone. The floor was covered by a carpet that must assuredly have been made expressly for that room, since it stretched right up to the skirting, concealing every particle of bare board. I could not see the pattern. I could only devise by the soft tread of the carpet that it was either of Persian or Turkish manufacture. In some places, where kissed by the moonlight, it was almost white, whilst in other parts it was rendered black by a hodgepodge of countless shadows lying thick upon it. Through the great bay windows opposite me, a magnificent panorama of lawn, meadows, and rivers, beyond which I fancied I could detect the needle-like front of a steeple, spread itself before my eyes. All this natural beauty lay enhanced by a thin covering of gleaming snow. It was Christmas. The glamour of the hour and season enchanted me. Past injuries and St. Rudolph's were forgotten. I was at peace with all men. At peace! What wouldn't I give if I could always be so? If these broad acres, this noble mansion, this stately apartment were mine, all mine, and the stillness of the room again depressed me. Where were the many guests my lady had mentioned? Where were the sounds of revelry, the high-pitched voices of women, the hoarser tones of men, and the indistinct murmuring of conversations, such as I had listened to in days of yore? How it had hummed and buzzed around me when plunged in pleasant reverie. It then had no more effect on my hearing than the lapping of the gentlest waves on the seashore. There were no such sounds now. These massive walls were a sure, impenetrable barrier to whatever might be going on outside. This room, far from being filled with giddy babblers, was empty, distractedly, painfully empty save for the dancing moonbeams and the moving shadows. But was it empty? My heart gave a violent, sickly throb as I recollected the look of disquietude, of indisputable grave apprehension in my lady's eyes as she peered around. Of what had she been afraid? Of the approaching twilight? Of the shadows? Of the gloom? And as I cast a terrified glance round me, I fancied, foolish fancy, that those palls of darkness I have already mentioned had come out further from the nooks and crannies and were fast approaching me. Those of us who have ever ridden on horseback at night across some dreary wilderness or along a lonely road have doubtless had occasion to observe a strange alteration in the behavior of our beast. Its psychic propensities have been suddenly and mysteriously awakened. It fights shy of some particular tree or stone or gap in the hedge. Its ears twitch, its flanks quiver. It is all on the tremble. The slightest sound would now make it take the bit in its teeth and bolt. It was afraid, not necessarily of what it had seen, but what it fears may be there. And, to an anomalous species of terror, I found myself a bounden slave. I dreaded to think of the effect even upon the most trivial sound or incident might now produce in my agitated mind. Had I been able, I would have risked the displeasure of my hostess and left the room, but I could not. Every atom of strength seemed to have quitted my body. I was pro tempore, cataleptic, paralyzed. A faint and almost imperceptible movement suddenly attracted my attention to a square patch of light on the carpet immediately before me. To my horror, something was coming through the floor. Slowly, very slowly. First of all, a head surmounted with a long disheveled black hair, then a face. God save me from seeing the like again, a face that might once have been a beautiful or plain or ugly, but now nothing. I won't describe, nothing but the grave. Then shoulders, bust, what was once a body, legs, Held in its arms in close embrace was the figure of a baby, in a like state of nudity and decay. For a moment, only for a moment, they stood swaying silently to and fro in the moonlight, and then with a snake-like movement of her body, the phantom of the woman glided across the room, vanishing into the recess containing the large bay window. After this subsidation of intense terror at this hideous spectacle, I had been compelled to witness the pulsating of my heart once again becoming normal. I was able to reflect with comparative calmness on what I had seen. I say with comparative calmness, for a strong suspicion now entered my mind that Lady Wentworth may have anticipated all along what would happen, and that I had put in that room as a mere experiment to see whether it was still haunted. The bare idea of such perfidy filled me with so great an indignation that I seriously thought of trumping up some excuse and returning home, my resolutions being shattered only by the opportune arrival of Cousin Robert, whose cordial welcome, acting like a stimulant, made me decide to remain. With a thoughtfulness that had singled him out from among his companions as a boy, he noticed my weariness, and putting it down to the fatigue of my journey, went in search of his wife's maid. Need I say that I was thankful to get to bed, and there, despite my ghostly adventures, I slept very soundly till the gong went for breakfast, at which free and easy meal I made the acquaintance of some of the very charming guests. My lady, of course, too much in request to spend more than a few moments with poor insignificant me. She expressed an earnest hope that I had not been too dull for words, and that I had found the room warm and comfortable. At all events, she added, you can sit and read there without fear of interruption. I know how fond of books you clever people are. You must go into the library and choose some. You were not disturbed last night, were you? Though this question was put in the most artless manner possible, and with all apparent ingenuousness, I detected a half-frightened, half-inquiring expression in her eyes that she vainly tried to stifle, an expression which converted the suspicion I had entertained into a conviction that this woman was isolating me to serve some deep and subtle purpose. I tried to get out of the lady's maid what this purpose might be, but if Webster knew, she most certainly showed no signs of it, being doubtless as accomplished an actress as her mistress. As one may readily conclude, I looked forward to the evening with little equanimity, offering up fervent prayers for any incident that might add to the duration of dinner. Now, I hate grand dinners as a rule. Their regality unnerves me. I am appalled at the number of people, at the dazzling display of plate, at the multiplicity of the courses, many of the dishes being unknown to me, and at the ceaseless flow of conversation, at the clatter of glasses, at the wine, at everything. But on this occasion I simply revelled in it. The greatest formalities appeared to me as pleasantly distracting. I was poor, my companions wealthy, scions of the aristocracy. I had nothing to do but eat and be silent and listen and look. And I saw all that one would have wanted to see in the atelier of the very best costumier in Paris or the West End. My own dress was shabby, but what of that? No one seemed aware of it. No one noticed me. I was a non-entity, mute, a consuming machine. In no one's way, because each of my neighbors was far too engrossed in eating to care about carrying on a conversation. Once I thought a lady cast a half-enviable glance at my hands. They are my best point, particularly so when nicely manicured. And once I imagined dear Robert, but there, that was only imagination. Well, the dinner, like all good things, came to an end at last. I enjoyed the dessert most. The bonbons were heavenly. Everyone ate them as if they were hungry. I caught myself actually pitying our hostess. At a signal from milady, we all got up. I left the other ladies in the hall. They trooped away to fetch their purses, whilst I, feeling very much like the poor whipped schoolgirl, slunk off to the ballroom. It was not until the door closed behind me I understood the full horror of the situation. I was alone, for the second time within 24 hours, in that chamber, alone save for those foul pollutions which might rise at any instant from beneath the floor. I believe even then I would have flown had not the stubbornness and pride innate in all my family restrained me. Come what would, her ladyship would never call me a coward. So I stuck to my post with heroic resolutions. Much as I suffered the previous day, my sufferings then in comparison now were small. nor did the dreadful anticipations that tortured me without cessation as I sat there waiting for the boards to part asunder in any way surpass the awful realization. Step by step, detail by detail, the psychic drama was repeated in all its damnable horror. My recovery after witnessing it being slower on this occasion, accompanied by relapses into a state of terror too painful even to recall. Yet I survived, and succeeded in so far pulling myself together that I met the kindly greeting of her ladyship at breakfast next morning with a calm and unembarrassed air. She did not suspect me. Once again the ordeal came, and my lady, with a refinement of cruelty worthy of her steel blue eyes and thin lips, herself conducted me to the fatal ballroom. "Tomorrow you will have company," she murmured, her face shining white amid that semi-gloom. "I must apologize for not giving you more light, but for some unearthly reason or other, only one of those gas jets will ever burn. Odd, is it not?" As her eyes met mine, I walked to the fire and burst out laughing. She was disarmed. How could anyone laugh who was afraid of ghosts? She speedily, very speedily, left me, and once again I underwent it all. Suspense, horror, prostration. I think I suffered more this third night than on either of the other two. Yet long before morning I had recovered from the shock. I saw a look of genuine relief rush into her ladyship's face as she encountered my smiling countenance. Whatever apprehensions she might have had with regard to that room were now unquestionably removed. "It must be cleared out without further delay," I heard her remark to Robert. "The floor will take some time polishing, and remember the incandescent burners." "The incandescent burners," I chuckled. "What effect would they have on ghosts?" I half expected she would now tell me why she had been so anxious I should remain in the room. She was assured it was no longer haunted. Why trouble about the past? But a moment's reflection made me think that, after all, it might be the past she was most anxious to conceal. Hauntings, especially of those so gruesome a nature as this, usually point to some blot on the escutcheon, to a disreputable something in the history of the house, and that is why so many people object to seeing their family ghosts appear in print. Accordingly, my lady, having the honor of Wentworth at heart, would take very good care she did not give me as much as a hint as to what she herself quite possibly attributed to legends. Webster did indeed favor me with the information that neither her ladyship nor anyone else save Lord Wentworth and the old charwoman who dusted were ever known to enter the room. That all events since she had been at the Hall, that was well nigh 10 years, which information clearly implied that entrance was strictly forbidden. It was interesting to speculate what course my lady would have adopted had I told her what I had seen. She was proud, domineering, and tactful. Would she have pooh-poohed the whole thing, commanded me to be silent, resorted to bribery, or what? I couldn't imagine her pleading, and yet the honor of the old aristocracy is very dear to them. They sometimes value it more than life. The next few days passed agreeably, and all too quickly for me. The non-card playing element, though rather stiff and prudish, were kindly disposed towards me, no doubt on account of my shy disposition and impecunious widowhood. Of Robert I saw very little. The host and hostess of a big house never have a moment to spare. To prepare the ballroom, an extra staff of servants was employed incessantly for 3 days, at the end of which time it was pronounced ready for the occasion. I can find no words to convey to others the singular way in which the altered room impressed me. Though stripped of all of its massive, gloomy furniture, brilliantly illuminated with many jets of incandescent gas, Robert had a strange aversion to electricity, and adorned with festoons of oriental flowers, banners, and the gayest colored bunting, it still retained an air of sadness and indescribable something that nothing short of total annihilation, could ever eradicate or modify. Her ladyship, clad in a snowy dress of the most costly material, trimmed with the rarest lace, her fair arms and bosom glittering with the Wentworth diamonds, looked like a fairy queen standing on the threshold of an enchanted castle. I looked closely at her, but could see no remnant of apprehension, either in her eyes or gestures. She was perfectly at ease and sublimely unconscious of aught but the enjoyment of those around her and the importance attached to herself, the well-dressed, handsome hostess. With Robert it was otherwise. In spite of his smiles, his bows, his many pretty actions of old-world gallantry, I could see that the wan, gray spirit of unrest stalking at his elbow never left him. He would have staked his soul to glance occasionally at the spot before the fireplace, but fear lest someone might see him effectually held him back. This continual mental struggle, unsuspected even by his wife, was only too obviously apparent to me, and I seemed to hear a sigh of relief, of deep and earnest relief, issue from his lips when the orchestra began. And now all was symphony and movement. There was much glare and glitter and piquancy, snake-like evolutions, spasmodic convergences, dexterous extrications, all performed and repeated with mathematical precision and untiring repetition. The music changed. The waltz gave place to a novel and somewhat wildly executed fandango. It was her ladyship's whim to include in her programme exotic dances, a resuscitation of long-forgotten terpsichord. They were undoubtedly the distinguishing and characteristic features of her entertainments, raising them so far above the commonplace and gaining for milady a world-wide and much coveted reputation. She hated anything merely popular and vulgar. In this dance that now commenced, and which I beheld for the first time, there was much of the beautiful, the wanton, the bizarre, and just a suspicion of something which might have shocked a very exacting Grundy. As the greater number of the guests, like myself, were unacquainted with it, the floor was left comparatively free for the performers, the onlookers lining the walls, the doorway, and the big bay window. Never had I witnessed such enthusiasm. The dancers, throwing their very heart and soul into their antics, gyrated and pirouetted in such lively fashion as evoked spontaneous outbursts of applause from the delighted, albeit bewildered and somewhat puzzled spectators. The faster the music, the quicker the feet, the louder the clapping. And now, at a moment when the revelry had reached its height, and the attention of all was riveted on the dancers, a sudden commotion in their midst made everyone wonder. What was it? What had happened? I glanced at the clock. Robert glanced too, and our eyes met. I read in his a deadly fear. It was the hour for the dead to rise. The space in front of the fireplace was now deserted, and the dancers, grouped around on either side, were eagerly peering forward to ascertain the cause of their alarm. Curiosity, repulsion, and horror wild and undiluted, were now depicted on every countenance as the gently heaving boards, slipping noiselessly asunder, revealed two hideous heads, rising as it were from the bowels of the earth. Slowly, very slowly, with a gradation suggestive of machinery, the phantoms I knew so well at length came into full view. But stupendous as was the sensation this unlooked-for tableau produced, not a sound was uttered. And as if to accentuate the silence, the music broke off abruptly, dancers, audience, and orchestra being similarly affected. For a few seconds the female phantom, clutching in one arm its loathsome burden, paused irresolutely beside its tomb, and then, shaking a hand in the direction of the Honorable Walter, it made a sudden dart at the spot where he stood. A thrill of the most intense horror accompanied this unexpected movement, all eyes being now transferred to the wretched youth. I gave one glance at my cousin Robert. I dare not look again. His expression was frightful. He could do nothing to help his son. His position was that of the damned. The crucial moment arrived. No one breathed. The thing from the grave reached Walter. There was no hesitation. They passed right through him. I looked at the wall, rubbed my eyes. The spectres had vanished. A convulsive throb now ran through the assemblage. The revellers exchanged frightened and embarrassed glances. There was a general movement to the door. The room emptied. The dance was over. I did not see her ladyship again. I merely received a message of farewell, but Robert came to say good-bye. "I wonder," he said, gazing at me with his pensive, harrowed eyes, "I wonder very much if the ghost appeared to you when alone in that room? If so, you have indeed been brave, and to keep its secret served us right. The story of the hauntings," he continued, "has up to the present been revealed only to the male members of our family, but to you I feel an explanation is due. At any rate, you are a Wentworth, and have given me ample proof that you may with safety be entrusted with the secret. It seems years ago that one of my ancestors got tangled in some way or another with a beautiful gypsy. She begged him to marry her. He refused, and fearful lest the affair should leak out, and so bring discredit upon the family, he murdered her, burying her body, together with that of her child, underneath the ballroom floor. At least so the manuscript states, and no one, as far as I'm aware, has ever disproved it. Tortured with the remorse and a victim to the orthodox fears of a murderer, my unhappy forefather took poison, commanding in his will that the ballroom should never again be used for a frivolous purpose, an injunction which, until last night, has been faithfully obeyed. The Wentworths, as you may naturally suppose, have kept the secret strictly to themselves, the male heirs alone being usually acquainted with it. I did not altogether credit the story of the haunting, though my father swore he had seen the cursed apparitions. Moreover, he told me that they appeared periodically, every night at 11 p.m. from the 20th to the 31st of December. He also warned me, and here I am much to blame, on no account to permit any outsider to be in the room, for if you do, he added, then something terrible will happen. I own I was skeptical, and bitterly I regret it now. I have never seen an apparition, and what my father told me he had seen I attributed to suggestion, the natural consequence of dwelling too much on the horrible details of the story. Maud shared my skepticism, and when she wanted to use the room, brought forward the most ingenious argument to overcome my scruples. I declared it was impossible. It would be sheer sacrilege. I was accused of inconsistency. I disbelieved. How then could there be any danger? The injunction in the will was unreasonable and absurd. In short, I had no peace. I had to yield. So making the stipulation that we should first find out some means by which we could prove that there was no foundation for the story of the haunting, I reluctantly gave my consent. Somewhat to my astonishment, Maud had already formed a plan for testing the room. She had heard me speak of you. You were a Wentworth. If you discovered anything, we could rely on you to keep it secret. And so my wife suggested you should be put in the room, just to sample it. I hesitated. I did not speak. I suppose my silence gave consent. The rest you know. I won't press you to tell me if you saw those beastly things. If you did, the sequel only serves us right. Anyhow, nothing can excuse my having sanctioned disobedience to that injunction in the will. The fact and the nature of the haunting is a secret no longer. The cause none but at Wentworth shall ever know. I need hardly enjoin you, who are one of us, to maintain silence on that point. We shall shut up the house for a time, until, in fact, the worst of the affair has blown over, and when we meet again, let us hope it will be under happier circumstances. We never met again. Within 6 months of my departure, both Robert and his son were dead, killed in a motor accident abroad. The property is now in the hand of very distant relations, and I feel no compunction in saying what I know about it. Only, if you repeat this to Mr. Elliott O'Donnell, please substitute fictitious names. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. Borough Farm, North Devon. The Headless Dog and the Evil Tree. Between my exit from the stage in 1900, up till quite recently, I had the very great misfortune to be a teacher in a small town in the north of England. I say misfortune because I found the contrasts between exciting stage land and the monotonous schoolroom, between the generous and jovial theatrical fraternity and the mean and petty local parents, too decidedly pronounced to be other than excessively unpleasant. I had small patience with the mediocre abilities of very mediocre children, and still less with the continual and unwarrantable interference of their ill-mannered and doting mothers. No lot in life could have been more thoroughly uncongenial than mine. Indeed, it would soon have become unbearable had it not been for the constant influx of strangers whose presence in town made an oasis in the desert. It is to one of these visitors, Miss Medley, that I owe the following story. Some years ago, she began, I received an invitation to spend August with a very crotchety old aunt of mine reviving at Borough Farm, North Devon. There was nothing at all extraordinary in the appearance of the house. It belonged to a type common to all parts of England. It was a low, rambling building of yellow stone with good substantial thatched roof and ample stabling. The rooms, sweet with the scent of jasmine and honeysuckle, compared more favorably with the stuffy dens in which I had been obliged to live in London, whilst the diamond-shaped window panes and massive oak beams, serving as supports to the ceiling, struck me as being quite delightfully quaint. My aunt, too, a rosy-faced old lady in a mob cap, appeared quite in harmony with her surroundings. She was kindness itself. Indeed, no one could have made me feel more thoroughly at home. "Folks do say the house is haunted," she laughed. particularly one room, but there, I have never seen anything, and I don't suppose you will." "A ghost!" I cried. "How awfully exciting! Oh, do let me sleep in the haunted room!" And I continued to plead until the kind-hearted old lady reluctantly consented. "You mustn't blame me if the ghost should visit you, Rosie," she said. "Remember, I have warned you." "There was nothing I should enjoy better than seeing a real bona fide spook, Annie dear," I rejoined, smiling, but my aunt shook her head reprovingly, and no more was said on the subject until the next day. I woke at night as the clock struck 2. Indeed, I fancied my awakening was due to that striking. It seemed so unusually loud and emphatic. It was a fine, indeed, I might say glorious night, for although there was no moon, the heavens were so brilliantly illuminated with myriads of scintillating stars that I could see every object around me almost as clearly as if it had been day. A sudden movement near the foot of the bed made me recollect my aunt's admonition. I listened, experiencing none of these pleasant anticipations of which I had spoken so boastfully. I knew no one could have entered the room, as I had taken the precaution to lock the door, having first of all looked under the bed and made a thorough examination of the hanging wardrobe. Consequently, my visitor, unless a mouse or a rat, could be nothing material. I devoutly wished I had slept in one of the other rooms. A faint and sickly odor now became perceptible, while the noise hitherto uninterpretable developed into a series of unequal knocks, just as if some animal were lying on the floor scratching itself. Determined not to appear frightened, I put my hand out of bed and called, "Trot, Trot, is that you?" Trot being the name of my Annie's retriever. Something instantly jumped up, and coming round the bed stood by my side. Wondering whether it could be Trot, though at a loss to understand how he could have gotten into the room without being seen, I stretched out my fingers and, to my intense relief, touched the furry coat, the stench at the same time becoming so truly awful that I retched. I could, of course, have satisfied myself as to the identity of my visitor by merely looking, but this, I am ashamed to say, I was too great a coward to do, a strange feeling telling me that I was in the presence of something unnatural. Running my hand fearfully along the shaggy skin of the animal, I felt for its head, discovering to my intense horror that it had none, the neck terminating in a wet mass of something soft and spongy. Unable to restrain myself any longer, I now looked, perceiving to my infinite horror a huge shock-haired spaniel, headless and in a most abominable state of decomposition. I gazed at it for some seconds, too appalled either to stir or utter a sound, this paralytic condition continuing till an abortive effort of the phantasm to jump on a bed loosened my tongue, and I shrieked for help. The dog immediately vanished. My feelings have been, however, so outraged by what I have witnessed that nothing would have induced me to pass the remainder of the night in that room. My own idea was to get out of it with utmost celerity. I did so, nor did I ever again, even in by daylight, venture to cross its threshold. My aunt, poor dear, was very much upset at the occurrence. She could not imagine how it was other people could see the ghost while she could not, and her skepticism was but natural. She was unable to grasp the idea that psychic faculty is a gift only granted to the few, and as rare as that either of music or painting. Other reasons for her incredulity in this particular occult manifestation lay in the enigmatical nature and purport of the phenomenon. In what category of ghosts could one classify a headless dog? Was it a spirit of a dog that had been decapitated on earth? She had never gathered from the scriptures that beasts had souls. What then was this phantom of a dog? I suggested it might be a poltergeist or elemental, one of those purely bestial creations that for various reasons, which you explained at your recent lecture, always haunt certain localities. Yes, I said, interrupting Miss Medley. The sub-animal type of elemental is fairly common. If you refer to the June number 1908 of the magazine published by the Society for Psychical Research, you will see an extremely well authenticated case of the haunting of a village by a white pig with an abnormally long snout, and I could enumerate many other similar instances. But continue. My aunt, Miss Medley went on, informed me that the house had been once occupied by a lady who had lived a very selfish, not to say sensual life. She had settled down in Borough after having been divorced twice, and her weekly routine was one incessant whirl of pleasure. She died without the consolation of the church, surrounded by a crowd of fawning money hunters and overgorged poodles, so that for this, as well as other reasons, I think there may be an alternative solution to the haunting. Is it not possible that what I saw was actually the spirit of this worldly woman, which, thoroughly brutalized by long indulgence in sensuality, had gradually adopted that shape most befitting it? And the moral of that, Miss Medley, I observed, is, if you do not wish to become a beast, do not live like one. Yes, there is much to be learned from the study of different types of phantasms, more, I believe, than from any pulpit discourses. Is that your only psychic experience? Miss Medley shook her head. No, she said. I had another very gruesome one at Borough. After the dog episode, my aunt saw fit to warn me not to pass along a certain road after dusk. There is an elm standing close to it, she said, which the people about here declare to be haunted. As you have seen one ghost, you may see another, so please be careful. Now, you may think that after such a disagreeable experience, I would have followed my aunt's advice. But, curiosity getting the better of discretion, I disobeyed her, and, selecting a fine evening for the enterprise, set out for the tree. As it was 2 or 3 miles away, and I was dearly fond of riding, I hired a horse, and going along at a jog trot, approached the forbidden spot at about 8 o'clock. The lane in which the haunted elm stood was narrow, trees of all sorts and sizes lined it on either side, and the shadows, intensified by the thickness of the foliage overhead, almost obliterated the roadway. All was dark and silent. I no longer wondered at the villagers fighting shy of such a place. It looked a positive cockpit of spookdom. At about 20 yards or so from the notorious elm, my horse showed unmistakable signs of uneasiness, laying back its ears and shivering to such an extent that it was only by dint of alternate threats and caresses that I succeeded in urging it forward. Arriving at a spot level with the tree, the animal shied, and had I not been a pretty good horsewoman, I might have met with a nasty accident. But I stuck to my seat like a leech, and using my whip smartly, drew in the reins. My horse fell back on his haunches, reared, plunged headlong forward, took the bit between its teeth, and we were off like the wind. Fortunately, I was prepared. Leaning back in the saddle, I enjoyed rather than otherwise so mad a career. But my pleasure received a sudden check when I perceived, to my horror, the figure of a tall woman dressed in black, striding along by the side of us and keeping pace with us without any apparent effort. Heaven alone knew where she came from, unless from the tree. I fancied I had heard something drop from the branches at the moment my horse shied. As the woman was wearing a cloak drawn over her head, I could not see her face, but from the grotesque outlines of her limbs and body, I concluded it must be unpleasantly bizarre. We kept together in this extraordinary fashion until we came in sight of Borough, where she quickened her steps, and tearing off the hood, thrust her face upward into mine. It was awful, utterly and inconceivably awful, so awful that I felt the very marrow in my bones freeze with horror, while my heart stood still. She had no hair. Her head was round and shiny, whilst her face, yellow and swollen, was covered all over with circular black spots, causing it to bear a striking resemblance to one of those old-fashioned carriage dogs. Her eyes were black and sinister. She had no nose, whereas her mouth was horrid, the most horrid thing about her. With a diabolical grin, she grabbed at my jacket and would, I believe, have torn me from my seat had we not, at this moment, in the very nick of time, arrived within sight of the gates of Borough Farm. My aunt, with several other people, was awaiting me, and as with a desperate spurt I galloped up to them, the infernal hag let go her hold of my jacket, slackened her pace, and vanished. The end of Chapter 12. Chapter 13. Carne House, near Northampton. The man in the flowery dressing gown and the black cat. Should anyone wonder why I continually select Northamptonshire and Gloucestershire as the scenes of my ghost stories, let me hasten to explain that my reason is obvious enough. With both these counties I have had a lifetime intimacy, and naturally have had more facilities and opportunities for collecting suitable material from them than from any other. I have not the slightest doubt other counties can show equally long lists of haunted houses, only I have not found them so easy to access. Moreover, the genial nature of the inhabitants of Northamptonshire especially has attracted me as well as aided me in my research. And although the burly Midland yeoman is inclined to scoff at things superphysical, his satire is not so objectionable as is that of the supercilious middle-class Londoner. Again, Northamptonshire is very rich in well-preserved old country mansions. I know of no other county where there are so many, And as most of these houses have at one time or another witnessed some grim tragedy, it is not surprising that now they are the scenes of occult manifestations. Doubtless one would find similar phenomena in smaller habitations, were the latter of the same early date, for crime was then just as prevalent among the poor as among the rich, but the inferior material with which cottages have been built causes their, comparatively speaking, early dissolution, and we rarely find a cottage now which was built more than a century ago. From this it must not be deduced that hauntings are confined to old buildings, or that past crime alone begat ghosts. Nothing of the sort. Modern villas are frequently subject to psychic phenomena, whilst the phantoms of present-day suicides and murderers are decidedly as numerous as of yore. But whereas in olden times crime was fairly common in villages, it is now chiefly confined to towns, and the houses that have witnessed murders, etc., are not infrequently entirely demolished or made to undergo some very radical alterations. Hence the ghosts disappear with their surroundings. This more so, perhaps, in the provinces than in London, as there are too many crimes in the latter for any particular one to be remembered for any length of time. Not long enough, in fact, to permanently damn the letting of a house. The word ghost is very elastic. It may be used in reference to many different types of spirits, and is, in fact, the only designation for that genus of which the departed soul of man is but a species. Now Northamptonshire is very rich in species of all kinds, spirits of men, of beasts, of vegetables, and species of elementals. Elemental being in itself a genus which includes many various types, too numerous indeed for any attempt at classification in this work. It is no uncommon thing to meet with some locality, usually barren, or village, generally on the site of barrows or druidic remains, as, for example, Guilsborough, where the nature of the hauntings is dual, a complexity that is, fortunately, of the rare occurrence in houses. Concerning the latter, Lee mentions one instance, i.e., the Gybe farm, in his book More Glimpses of the Unseen World, whilst I take this opportunity to quote another case of dual haunting, i.e., Carne House, which is situated at the utmost extremity of a village to the southeast of Northampton. My informant, Mrs. Norton, frequently resided in the house in her childhood and youth, and it was from her lips that I heard the following story, which I recollect only too well. My first impression of Carne House was one of extreme aversion. I can see it now as I saw it then, vast, sleek, and white, like some monstrous toadstool or slimy fungus. Bathed in moonlight, we did not arrive too late. It confronted us with audacious nudity, not a plant or shrub being trained to hide its naked sides. There was something unspeakably loathsome in the boldness of its carriage, something that made me glance with fear at its wide and gaping windows, and glance again as I crossed the threshold into the dark and lofty hall. The passages of the house, both in number and sinuosity, resembled a maze. They recalled to my youthful mind the story of Daedalus, and I half expected to see the figure of the Minotaur suddenly arise from some gloomy corner and pursue me through the labyrinth. Nor were my fears entirely groundless, for I had hardly been in the place a month before I had a very unpleasant experience. Chancing one morning to go on an errand for my mother to a room that had, in all probability, once served as a laundry, but which was now restricted to lumber, I was startled at hearing something move either in or on the copper. Thinking it must be some stray animal, or, may be, a rat, I threaded my way through the sea of packing cases, and standing on tiptoe, peeped very cautiously into the copper. To my intense surprise, I found myself looking into a very deep and sepulchral well, at the bottom of which was a man. I could see him distinctly, owing to a queer kind of light that seemed to emanate from every part of his body. He was draped in a fantastic costume that might have been a kimono, or one of those flowery dressing gowns worn by our great-great-grandfathers. He was bending over a box which he was doing his best to conceal under a pile of debris, and it was undoubtedly this noise that had attracted me. Too intent on his work, he was apparently unaware of my close proximity, until, satisfied that the box was well hidden, he straightened his back and looked up. His face frightened me, not that it was out of anything of the normal, either in feature or complexion, but it was the expression, the look of evil joy that suffused every lineament before he saw me, changing to one of the most diabolical fury as our eyes met. I was at first too transfixed with terror to do more than stare, and it was only when, crouching down, he took a sudden and deliberate spring at the wall and began to climb up it like a spider, that I regained possession of my limbs and, turning around, fled for my life. Oh, how long that room seemed, and what an interminable succession of furniture now appeared to barricade the way. Every yard was a mile. Every instant I expected he would clutch me. I reached the door only just in time. Happily for me it was open. I darted out, and as I did so the outlines of a hand, large and ill-shapen, shot fruitlessly past me. The next moment I was in the kitchen. The servants were there. I was saved from a fate that would assuredly have sent me mad. When I related what had happened to my mother, she laughingly informed me I must have been dreaming, that there was no well there, nor was there a man in the house save my father and the servants. Yet I fancied I could detect beneath those smiling assurances a faint and scarcely perceptible horror, and she never let me visit that room again alone. But was I dreaming? Was there no well? And had that man been but the fancy of a childish and distorted brain? Sometimes I answered yes, and sometimes no. After this little incident, a manifest, though of necessity, subtle change took place in our household. The servants became infected with a general spirit of uneasiness, which, although only shown in my presence by their looks, convinced and alarmed me far more than any fears. Even the most terrible would have done had they been outspoken. I was positive they lived in daily anticipation of something very dreadful, something that lay concealed in those dark and tortuous corridors, or in that grim and ghostly room. My dreams at night were horrible. Nor again did I feel that in this respect I was singular, as I overheard someone remark that no one ever passed the night without awakening with a sudden and inexplicable start. I say inexplicable. Would that it had always remained so. It was August when my next definite adventure occurred. I use the word definite, as I had had several other experiences, but of too brief and uncertain a nature to enable me to draw any precise conclusions. Once, as I had been walking along one of the passages, I had heard a noise or something clanking, and it had been put to instant flight by the sound of heavy footsteps echoing suddenly in my rear, and again, but this wasn't really worth recording. Let me proceed with that night in August. As I slept in a room at the end of the corridor, my nearest neighbor, Miss Dovecote, our governess, occupying a chamber some dozen yards away. I do not think I need to describe any article of furniture the room contained. Every piece was strictly modern, and had been brought with us from a newly furnished house in Sevenoaks. The fireplace and cupboard are, however, deserving of comment. The former was one of those old-fashioned angles Burns delights in describing, and which are now so seldom to be seen. An inn at Dundry, near Bristol, containing, I believe, the finest specimen in the kingdom, whilst the latter, which I always kept secretly locked at night, was of such far-reaching dimensions that it might as well be termed in modern phraseology a linen room. On the night in question I had gone to bed at my usual time, 8, and I had speedily fallen asleep, as I was in the habit of doing, but my slumber was by no means normal. I was tortured by a series of disturbing dreams, from which I awoke with a start to hear some clock outside sonorously strike 12. As an additional proof of my wakefulness, I might add, pardon my explicitness, I was sensibly affected by a constant irritation of the skin, due, I believe, to a disordered state of the liver, in which itself was a sufficient preventive to further sleep. It must have been 12:30 when I heard, to my intense horror, the cupboard door, which I distinctly recollect locking, slowly, very slowly, open. My first impulse was to take a precipitous dash for the door, but, alas, I soon became aware that I was powerless to act. A kind of catalepsy, coming on suddenly, held my body as a vice, whilst my senses, on the other hand, had grown abnormally acute. In this odious condition I was now compelled to listen to the thing, whatever it might be, slowly crossing the floor in the direction of my bed. The climax at length came, and my cup of horrors overflowed, when, with an abruptness that was quite unexpected, in spite of the direst apprehension, the thing leaped on the bed, and I discovered it to be an enormous cat. I can unhesitatingly add the epithet black, for the room, which a moment before was shrouded in darkness, had now become a blaze of light, enabling me to perceive the color as well as the outline with the most unpleasant perspicuity. It was not only the intensity of color, the blackest ebony could not have been blacker, that the cat was abnormal, but in every other respect Its dimensions were not far removed from those of a large bulldog, and its expression, the eyes and mouth of the beast were more than bestial, was truly satanic. Stalking over my legs, its tail almost perpendicular and swaying slightly like the nodding plumes of a hearse, it squatted down between the bedposts opposite, transfixing me with a stare full of malevolent meaning. I was so fully occupied in watching it and trying to solve the enigma I saw so plainly written in its every gesture, that I did not realize I had other visitors, till a sudden uncertain twitching in the light made me look round. I then perceived with a start a fire was burning in the grate. A fire, and in August, how incongruous! I shivered, but it was no delusion. The flames soared aloft, adopting 100 fantastic yet natural shapes. The coals burned hollow, and in their crimson and innermost recesses I read the future. But not for long. My cogitations were unceremoniously interrupted by the appearance of the man in the well, whom I was startled to perceive seated in the chimney corner in the most nonchalant attitude, possibly nursing a baby. Anomalous and mirth-provoking as is such a sight in the usual way, the existing circumstances were grim enough to excite my horror and raise anew my worst forebodings. Suppose he saw me now, there was no escape. I was entirely at his mercy. What would he do? I glanced from him to the cat, and from the cat back again to him. Of my two enemies, which was the most feared? The slightest movement on my part would inevitably rouse them both, and bring about my immediate destruction. The situation did not even warrant my breathing. The minutes sped by with the most tantalizing slowness. The clock struck 1, and neither of my visitors had budged an inch. The man in the flowery dressing gown still nursing the baby, and the black cat still staring at me. Mine was indeed the most unenviable position, and I was despairing of its ever being otherwise, when a sudden transmutation in the man sent a flow of icy blood to my heart. He no longer regarded his burden indifferently. He scowled at it. The scowl deepened. The utmost fury pervaded his features, converting them into those of a demon. He got up, gnashed his teeth, stamped on the ground, and lifting up the child dropped it head first into the fire. I saw it fall. I heard it burn. The hideous cruelty of the man, the abruptness of his action, proved my undoing. Oblivious of personal danger, I shrieked. The effect was electrical. Dropping the poker with which he had been holding down the baby, the inhuman monster swung round and saw me. The expression in his face at once became hellish, absolutely hellish. My only chance of salvation now lay in making the greatest noise possible, and I had commenced to shout for help lustily, when at a signal from the man, the enormous black cat crouched and sprang. What followed I cannot exactly remember. I have dim recollections of feeling a heavy thud, and of someone or something trying to tear away the clothes from my head, after which there came a very complete blank, and when I recovered consciousness, the anxious countenance of my parents and the governess were bending over me. The next night I slept with my sister. My health had been so impaired by these encounters that my parents decided to move elsewhere. The furniture was once again packed, and within a month of the above incident we had taken up our abode in Clifton, Bristol. The history of the hauntings was subsequently revealed to me by the owner of the house. It had once been inhabited by a man of the name of Darby, who seems to have been a sort of wholesale butcher. His elder brother dying, the family estate passed to the latter's eldest son, a child of 2, and Darby, determining to succeed to the property, invited the widow to stay with him. She did so. She was a weakly creature, and he got rid of her by putting her to sleep in a damp bed. The children were next disposed of, the younger being burnt, as I had witnessed, and the elder, aged 2, by being smothered to death by a black cat. Darby is said to have deliberately made the cat sit upon the infant's mouth as it lay asleep. But these rapid deaths, as might have been expected, aroused suspicions. The nurse, who had been an unwilling partner in the burning of the baby, turned king's evidence, and a warrant for his arrest was issued. As is often the case, however, the officers of the law were a bit too late. When they arrived at the house, the quarry had flown, nor could his whereabouts be discovered for many years. Not, indeed, till 50 years after the crimes, when his skeleton was found in the bottom of a disused well he had sunk himself in one of the back kitchens. Under the skeleton lay an iron box containing many valuables, rings, etc., which he had been doubtless striving to hide when death in some unaccountable form or another overtook him. What became of the cat, history does not say. The place had always borne a reputation for being haunted. It was on that account my parents had got it at so low a rental, and the ghosts seen there, undoubtedly those of Darby and his cat, corresponded in every detail with the phenomena that had so terrified me. I am aware that many deny the existence of souls in animals. Let them do so, but do not let them be too dogmatical, for where life ends, all is mystery. Still, there is an alternative theory to account for the appearance of animal phantoms, which is, I think, quite within the realms of possibility. The black cat I saw, if not the spirit of the one made such hideous use of by the old man, was undoubtedly an elemental, a spirit representative of a popular crime, a vice, Darby's evil genius, that ever hovered at his heels in his lifetime, and is more loath than ever to leave him now that his physical body is dead and his soul earthbound. The end. Chapter 13.